Welcome, ladies. Today is going to be the first video that we will be using our Flip the Classroom technique. We're going to be starting it on the section 1 and 2 reading of the chapter 10 part of our textbook. Things that we cover today are not the only exclusive events from the sections 1 and 2 reading. You will be asked to find other things that are not covered on today's slide presentation. Now, to get started, we're going to be discussing slavery in the 1850s. Particularly, we're going to be looking at how slavery was the most divisive issue in the United States facing us during the period before the Civil War. Now, in front of you, you'll see the word divisive highlighted. I highlighted that because I'll be highlighting that and certain other key words for you to take note of. Those are important. It shows that that is an important part of what we're going to be covering. Now, we'll be looking at slavery and how it impacted laws or politics, and how it impacted the United States socially. Now, as we do everything, we'll be starting with what our objectives are going to be. In this case, I'll read along as you read. Explain how slavery influenced laws being passed during the 1850s. Describe the violent actions occurring in America following the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Summarize the violent actions taken by John Brown to abolish slavery in the United States. Now, we will start with the Compromise of 1850, proposed by Henry Clay when California applied for statehood to the Union. California applied as a free state, and because of this, it would have broke political balance in the Senate. Southerners opposed the measure. Henry Clay came up with a 5-term compromise. Now, I'm going to use the map displayed on this slide to show you what elements of the compromise were. Now, we have multiple components for the Compromise of 1850. First, California will be admitted as a free state. Secondly, the Utah and New Mexico territories will be opened for popular sovereignty. Now, on the slide, you can see popular sovereignty is highlighted. That is when the people get to choose their government, and that government will then support or oppose slavery. Now, I'd like to point out the Missouri Compromise line here. Remember, we covered the Missouri Compromise back in December. The Missouri Compromise had 2 components. Number 1, when a new state was admitted into the Union, if it was going to break balance between free and slave, an additional state would be admitted to maintain balance. And number 2, anything above this line that I'm circling with my mouse would be considered free territory. Now, if we look across this line, you'll see that Utah is above the line. Therefore, it already violates part of the Missouri Compromise. We'll go further into that argument in our next slide, which is the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Proposed by Stephen Douglas, Senator of Illinois, the Kansas-Nebraska Act was going to issue the rules for territories in the area of Kansas and Nebraska to apply for statehood. Stephen Douglas wanted this because he wanted a railroad connecting Illinois, which I'm highlighting right over here, to California. Now, in order for him to get his railroad, he needed Kansas and Nebraska to both become a state in the Union. So he came up with his own law, his own compromise. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at the map and understand the components of compromise to know what the Kansas-Nebraska Act was. First, as we can see clearly highlighted by this map, all of the green territory designates free states. All of the red territory designates slave states. Now, in yellow, you'll see part of what the Compromise of 1850 was with Utah and New Mexico, designating those states would be decided by popular sovereignty. Now, the issue at hand is between Kansas and Nebraska. What Stephen Douglas proposed was using popular sovereignty on those territories as well. That made a lot of Northerners very angry because, as we talked about, the Missouri Compromise, which I'm currently circling over, clearly states slavery cannot exist above this line. Yet, Congress, and with the support of the President, decided to support Stephen Douglas's Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now later on, we're going to be looking at some of the social consequences of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. But right now, what we're going to do is move on to one of the last major political battles of the 1850s over the slave issue. And that's the Dred Scott decision. Dred Scott, who you can see on the right of the screen, was a slave who was brought to free territory with his slave master and lived there for 10 years. Dred Scott's slave master died. And when he died, Dred Scott assumed he was a free man because he was living in free territory. Later on, his master's family appealed to retrieve him. Because he was living on free soil, he had assumed he was free. So he appealed to the Supreme Court for his freedom. The Supreme Court, led by Roger Taney, who's on the left of the screen, said that Dred Scott was not considered a citizen. Therefore, he had no right to sue for his freedom. Thus, he had to return back to his slave master's family. This created an enormous controversy with Northerners. They felt that if they had to follow this rule, and the Fugitive Slave Act, which was a part of the Compromise of 1850, then why should they even bother creating laws that abolish slavery? There would be enormous divisions in the American political system over the Dred Scott case. In fact, if we want to look at some of the causes of the Civil War, this is going to be up there with several of the things we have already previously covered, and some of the things we'll be covering in just a little bit. Now we're going to be moving on the social problems facing the United States in the period of the 1850s. Following the Kansas-Nebraska Act, when it came time to actually vote to determine whether Kansas would be a free or slave territory, there was a lot of violence occurring. These violent actions occurring in Kansas following the Kansas-Nebraska Act are known as Bleeding Kansas. The first of which is the town of Lawrence, Kansas. The town was established by anti-slave forces. Their businesses were dedicated to ending slavery. They had newspapers, multiple ones, dedicated with showing the horrific issues around slavery. Pro-slave forces from Missouri rode into Kansas, Lawrence, Kansas, and they started attacking men, women, and children, burning down businesses, destroying the printing press, and murdering people in cold blood. This issue brought a very stark reality to America, and that was that the slave issue is now making American citizens kill one another. Back when the Founding Fathers established the country, they had never thought it would come to this. But in the period of the 1850s, we've now come to it that Americans are killing each other over the slave issue. Our next issue under the social sphere of slavery is John Brown. John Brown is a radical abolitionist who takes the abolition of slavery in his own hands. He will believe that violence is the only way to counter pro-slave forces. The first of which he commits in 1856 at Pottawatomie Creek. In retaliation to the Lawrence murders, John Brown goes to Pottawatomie Creek and calls out 5 individuals he believes are slave holders or supporters of slavery. He asks them to get on their knees, and behind them he begins to kill them with swords. John Brown is viewed as a terrorist in the South, a radical in the South. In the North, John Brown is viewed as a hero. Now we're going to look at the last instance of John Brown's life in which he uses violent actions to support his views on ending slavery. In 1859, John Brown and 21 other people are going to take weapons at Harper's Ferry. With these weapons, John Brown wanted to lead a slave revolt. He had sent messages to slaves all along the Virginia region. And this message was clear and simple. Join me, and we will fight for your freedom. When John Brown goes to Harper's Ferry and he leads this raid, no one shows up. John Brown and several of his sons are wounded, killed, and captured. The illustration on this photograph over here highlights the last moments of John Brown's life. And as you could see, John Brown is walking out of a courthouse and he's walking towards the gallows in which he will be hung. He's kissing a black baby who's held up by a black slaveholder. I'd like to just highlight that and give you a moment to look at it. Now we have here is John Brown in 1859, the year he will lose his life over slavery. Many, including Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass, did not agree with John Brown's violent actions. In fact, if you want to equivocate it to modern-day terms and civil rights, John Brown could be Malcolm X compared to Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln's Martin Luther King Jr. The last thing I want to highlight to you guys is this billboard that occurred the month before John Brown is to die. As you can read, it says, "Treason. All true Christians who believe in immortality through Jesus Christ alone are requested to pray for Captain John Brown, who is now under sentence of death and is to be hung next month for the righteousness' sake and doing justly with his fellow man, his country, and his God. By request of one who loves the truth and feels for the man that is to die a martyr to it. In the North, on the day he dies, church bells will ring it in his honor."